Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This episode is brought to you by Experian. Are you paying for subscriptions you don't use, but can't find the time or energy to cancel them? Experian could cancel unwanted subscriptions for you, saving you an average of $270 per year. And plenty of time. Download the Experian app. Results will vary. Not all subscriptions are eligible. Savings are not guaranteed. Paid membership with connected payment account required.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Few phrases engender less confidence than, I'm not an expert, but... However, I'm going to start this podcast by saying, I'm not an expert, but we're going to talk about saltwater fly fishing. Let me qualify that a little bit. So I'm primarily a trout fisher, and then underneath that, I fish warm water species, and then I would say saltwater is probably like a third position, solidly. That being said, I do fish saltwater quite a bit. I'm living in the North Shore of Massachusetts, so I have a spectacular saltwater fishery right at the backyard, and I also have access to the Maine coast and the Cape of Massachusetts, and so there's a lot of opportunities that I've been able to explore, and I'm learning, and I'm spending a lot more time doing it, and I think I've kind of dialed down the basics. I wouldn't say I'm an expert saltwater fisher, but I guess I wouldn't say I'm an expert trout fisher also. But I don't think that you necessarily need to have all the I's dotted and T's crossed to share some basic information. So the reason why I'm doing this podcast, even though I will readily admit that I am not an expert in this, is that I think I have the kind of knowledge that is necessary for my audience, for you, for the people listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast, and the people who are reading castingacross.com. The reason being, looking at the comments I get, looking at the demographics of where people are reading, most folks that are listening and reading are trout fishers, which makes sense. The majority of what I write about is trout, and then warm water being a second, saltwater being a third. So hopefully this will be helpful to you. But if you are a saltwater fly fisher and you haven't tuned out already, which I wouldn't blame you if you did, this is important because, as I've said multiple times before, I think there's value in hearing the basics spoken of in different ways, which helps you, first of all, understand why you do what you do, and also helps you communicate why you do what you do. So many things in life, but in fly fishing, I think we just take for granted. Why is a tapered leader tapered? I don't know. It's just the way it is. What's the difference between a 4-weight and a 6-weight? One's bigger and one's lighter. Things like that we might have kind of a half answer and we can functionally get it, but the more we know about something, the better we can communicate it to somebody who is just getting started or have to answer questions, and we begin to build our own knowledge base, and the nuances start to fill in. All right, huge preamble, but here's what I want to talk about. What you need to just get out in the salt and fish. A lot of people might be fishing only once a year or twice a year, but a lot of places you go, if you're going to be doing a DIY trip, so you go into the beach with your family, you're going to New Jersey, or you're going to Maryland, or you're going to the Carolinas, and you just want to get out in the water and fish for a few hours after the kids go to bed, or you have a couple hours in the middle of the day where you can fish. You don't want to necessarily spend $600, $800 on a guide. You also don't want to rent fly gear, which probably, if you do that once or twice, you'll be able to pay for the gear yourself. So I want to give you a little bit of a primer on what you need to get out and do some DIY fly fishing. So the first thing, the most important thing, is a fly rod. Obviously, it's also the most fun thing to buy. Who doesn't want another rod? Here is my suggestion. Buy a fly rod that you'll be able to use at home. So even if you don't live by the ocean, buy a fly rod that you'll be able to use at home. And what this will do is this will help you determine what rod weight to get. So this is what I mean by that. If you live somewhere where you are able to fish for smallmouth bass, where you're able to fish for large carp, and where you're able to fish for trout with large streamers, then get an 8-weight. That 8-weight will be more than sufficient for most saltwater applications. Now, if you live somewhere where your fishing opportunities may expand beyond what you're used to into things like pike and muskie or a larger bass, then get a 10-weight. That will do great for what you're doing back home, but then also give you those opportunities to throw bigger flies and bigger, heavier lines in the salt. So what this does is it takes your investment of everything from a couple $100 to, if you wanted to, well over $1,000, and it makes that rod much more versatile. You haven't just gotten a rod that only goes with you in case you and the family go to the beach for a vacation for the week, or you find an opportunity to get away with some friends and go do a DIY trip for a couple of days. But this is a rod that's also useful to you. And then, of course, you can split the difference and get the 9-weight also. I think the 9-weight is pretty perfect for a lot of shore fishing where I live. Both for its ability to throw heavier lines and heavier flies into wind, with wind either at your back or with the wind. But an 8-weight and a 10-weight also have their merits. But I would say if you're getting a rod that's only going to be used in the salt every once in a while, that think about how else you can use that rod, and then you get a lot more value out of it. But then the next important thing is, can you cast that fly rod? A lot of 4-weights and 5-weights for trout fishing, even if that rod's not a great fit, you're able to work around because there's not a whole lot there. In fact, a good line can turn a kind of an inferior rod into a great casting tool. Similarly, a good caster can turn an inferior rod into a good casting tool. However, when you get into these heavier rods, and even with the modern technology being what it is, the flex profiles and the tapers of these rods and how lightweight they are, all of those things still taken into account, throwing an 8-weight for half a day, throwing a 10-weight for half a day is going to start to magnify some of those flaws in the casting. So if it's not a great fit for you, then don't get it. That might even be indicative of going down to a slower rod, which generally in saltwater terms, that means a less expensive rod. Not always the case, but sometimes that's the way it pans out. That being said, you can get some pretty decent 8, 9, 10 weights for right around $200. Most of the major manufacturers have a series that's their entry-level series, or one above that is more than sufficient for the needs of somebody who is not only an occasional saltwater angler, but somebody who's in the salt all the time. That being said, and I know I've given like 1,000 caveats already, and we're only 7 minutes into the podcast, saltwater is, I personally believe, really where you see the benefits of getting a premium fly rod. Casting those $800, $900 rods really is a huge difference. Now, if you're fishing half days or a few hours here and there, and you're only doing it a couple times a year, is it necessary to make that investment? Probably not, unless you have means and unless that's a something that matters to you. Or maybe you realize, this is a rod I can use at home for a smallmouth, or I can use it at home for pike or whatever. But that's totally unnecessary. I just think it's worth mentioning that more so than most warm water applications and most trout applications, the higher end saltwater rods really do a lot for you. And this matters because you're not just casting flies. You're casting heavy flies. You're casting heavy wet flies. You're casting heavy, wet, wind-resistant flies. And you're also casting weighted lines, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what rod to look for. I'd say find a rod that can do double duty for you back at home if you're not anywhere close to the water, and find something that fits your casting stroke. So go to fly shops and do this. Do not, just because you're spending only, quote unquote, only $200 on a fly rod, don't just buy it off the rack online. Go to the fly shops, try them out, tell them what you're doing, tell them, if my whole, dual purpose scheme makes sense to you, tell them that. And they might say, well, this will work for the salt, but this will really be an excellent rod for streamers, for trout, or this will really be a great largemouth rod where you're fishing, and you'll be able to spend a couple $100 and get a good dual purpose rod. All right, rods. A whole lot less to say about reels. Reels, again, more important than the salt than in freshwater, but not necessarily because of the drag. I feel like most drag systems of the reputable reel manufacturers these days are rock solid. But what you're looking for is not just a solid drag, but a sealed drag. And that is going to give you more longevity in your reel. And that's really kind of a good time to interject all this stuff. If you aren't fishing in the salt regularly, you're going to have to get used to rinsing off your gear. And this is what would allow you to get a relatively inexpensive reel, something that might not be as industrial and heavy duty. Those die-cast aluminum reels, there's some spectacular die-cast aluminum reels for under $200 that work great in freshwater and saltwater, and that would probably be the best option for somebody who is getting into it for the first time and wants something inexpensive and something that's going to really perform great if you're only using it every once in a while. This isn't what you'd want if you were you owned a boat or if you were a guide, but if you're just going to be out every once in a while, you take care of it, you don't drop it on rocks too much, and you rinse it, then a die-cast aluminum reel is going to be more than sufficient if it has a sealed drag, and that drag is sufficient for handling big fish, which virtually everything is these days. Rod, reel, line. So I've said this before in other contexts, but if you only had $300 to spend on reel and line, you've got your rod already lined up. That's priority number one. But you've got maybe $300 or $250 left in your budget for reel and line. I would skimp on the reel and spend more on the line. As long as you check the boxes that I mentioned earlier with the reel, then get a better line. I'd rather have a $150 reel and $100 line than a $250 reel and the cheapest line you can find. A good line is going to stand up better to time and to the harsher conditions of salt, and B, it's going to cast better. You want a line with a taper profile that is going to operate optimally at those 40, 50, 60 foot distances and longer, rather than maybe a general purpose fly line, which is going to really max out at that 50 foot length. Also, you're going to want something that is built for the salt, gives you that longevity. This will also turn, as I mentioned earlier, that lower end fly rod, that maybe introductory level fly rod, into a much more effective casting tool. I can't say it enough. People don't cast their rods as well as they can because they put cheap line on expensive rods. This is something that I'm not the only one saying this. A lot of people are saying it. So get good line. Also, get a floating line and a sinking line. This is maybe where you start to get into quote unquote, wants over needs, but having two spools, one of a floating line and one of a sinking line, is very, very important for a lot of the environmental conditions you're going to find. Different times of year, different tides. There's a chance that you might have the perfect presentation, but the fish are not going to look, up or look down. So getting a sinking line is important. And what I would do is, there's a few things to think about. But first of all, finding a uniform sinking line, not just a sink tip like you would use for trout or something like that, but a like a depth charge or something like Orvis sells is a great line, because it is thinner diameter and it really does a good job getting that fly down. It's a beast to cast, but this is an essential part of the saltwater game. And honestly, it should be an essential part of all of your fly fishing, having that at your disposal, because it really does make a difference. And it saves a lot of jury rigging up, poly leaders and weight and weighted flies. And if you just have a sinking line, it can make things a lot easier. So if you can get another spool and another line, I would say to definitely do so. What's next? What's next is leaders. So buy your tapered knotless leader and loop it on there. Now, personally, in the salt, because of the surges of some of these fish, even when they're close, that just blows virtually every freshwater fish out of the water. I don't like the loop-to-loop connections in the salt. I'll tie if I do, I clip the one that's on there off, and I put a new one on there with really heavy butt section fluorocarbon and make that loop really, really tiny. But I like a nice smooth transition in the between the line and the leader. Then I carry 3 or 4 spools of fluorocarbon on me, some 10, some 12, some 15, and some 20, so I can change the length of the leader and really rebuild that whole leader from tippet material. You don't need the kind of finesse that you might be used to if you're fishing for trout. So having a knotless tapered leader as a base, as a butt, and then to add on to it with fluorocarbon tippet is a great way to go. Okay, now flies. This is a ridiculous question to try to answer, but there's actually a really good answer, and that's just have a box full of clouser minnows. And if you're going to have clouser minnows, have them in white, chartreuse and white, olive and white, and black. That's a great start. From there, you add your deceivers, you add your poppers, you add whatever is good for where you're going. You call the fly shop, and if you want to buy them ahead, buy them ahead. If you want to buy them when you get down there, get them when you get down there. But you tie these knots good, and you're going to be able to hang on to these $4, $5, $6 flies for quite a while. The hooks will probably go before the fly goes if you're fishing them well, or they'll get chewed up, I should say, before you lose the fly. But you really can't go wrong with weighted clouser minnows. You can strip them fast across the top. If you don't have a popper, you can drag them really slow and twitch them along the bottom, and they might think it's a shrimp or a crab. And those colors, again, white, olive and white, chartreuse and white, and black are great colors to kind of cover the entire spectrum of virtually all bait fish and other forage critters that saltwater fish are looking for. Of course, there are some things that those flies are not going to catch certain times of year, certain species, but that's a great basis. If you can tie flies, you can tie clouser minnows. You just got to get some, size 2 or 1-aught hooks, and then actually I like also, if you're going to have some flexible flies in your box, tie those clousers with synthetic hair, super hair, or the fake bucktail or whatever, because what you can do then, especially if you use like a size 2 hook, you can trim them down and make them shorter if the flies are way too big. So I would tie my tails on my synthetic clousers a little bit longer. That gives me the flexibility to have a little bit bigger fly even if the hook is small, and then if I need to, I can trim them back if I'm getting short strikes or I'm looking around and all the bait fish are much smaller than what I'm fishing. All right, so those are your terminal gear: rod, reel, lines, plural, leader, and flies. You're fishing. You got that stuff, you're fishing. What other stuff is necessary? Of course, sunglasses. There's no way you can not have anything that I just mentioned, but before anything else, have the sunglasses. But that's true for fishing in general, fly fishing in particular. You need sunglasses. You see structure, you see cover, you see fish, and you can stay safe. And if you're listening to me, chances are it's because you're going somewhere new or different. You want to know where you're walking and where you're wading, which brings up some of the next things. First is wading boots or shoes. If you're on sand, you're good to go. Go barefoot, whatever, unless you're afraid of crabs, in which case, wear your old tennis shoes. But if you're going to be on rocks and those rocks have seaweed, if those rocks have barnacles, if those rocks have, clams, you want a pair of heavy-duty wading boots, and you want some metal spikes or bars. I still fall down, and I've got, the industry top of the line, boots. My corkers are awesome, but there's really no way that you can wade on rocks at any speed and not risk falling down. And I wade much faster than I should. My corkers are great. I've got the big industrial spikes on them, but I still slide around sometimes if I step poorly. So this is a much more dangerous proposition too than wading around in your trout stream. So make sure you have good boots with metal spikes, not studs, but actual spikes, or bars if you're going to be walking on rocks. And you don't get, you see people out on jetties, and sometimes that just makes me nervous. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I don't know. Jetties are kind of terrifying in my mind. After that, a good pair of pliers. You never know what you're going to catch. There's stuff out there with teeth, and there's stuff out there with spikes, and you have no clue what you're going to catch in the salt. And that's one of the cool things about it. I mean, there's some variety in freshwater. You get surprised by some quote-unquote bycatch, but in the salt, I mean, there is a remarkable diversity of species, and a lot of these things have teeth and sharp spines and, tails with whips, and it's like the stuff that they draw on the edges of the maps back when they still hadn't mapped everything out. That's the stuff that you're catching. So a good pair of pliers that you can kind of grab that fly and just shake that crazy looking fish loose. And even if you're not sure, it's just best to, take caution and use your pliers, not your fingers. Don't lip everything like a bass. That's not a good idea. And then a stripping basket. Stripping baskets are going to make your casting easier across the board, and they're going to make your casting possible if you are around aquatic vegetation or rocks or clamshells or mussels or whatever. It also preserves your line. The tide is great at washing your expensive fly line in between your boot and the rock that you're standing on. So having a stripping basket kind of keeps that line there, which preserves your line, makes it so you're able to cast and shoot line, but also, you're focusing on your casting. And if you've got that heavy line and that heavy fly, you do want to focus on the casting. Recently, I was trying to be cute and quick, and I was just trying to get a few casts in before I had to go, and I was looking down, trying to untangle the line from my feet, and that clouser hit me right in the middle of the chest, right through my waders. Thankfully, it wasn't my neck or my face or anything like that, but a stripping basket would have been very, very beneficial in that situation. So that is kind of a quick synopsis of the gear that you should consider getting if you are a trout guy or gal or a warm water fly fisher and you want to give saltwater fly fishing a chance. If you do have those opportunities when you're on family vacations, or it's a few hours away and you figure that this year might be a good year for you to try to catch a redfish or try to catch a striper, these are some things to think about. Part 2 is going to be more about technique, location, and tides. But honestly, just like any other kind of fishing, go out and give it a shot. The first stripers I caught, I just walked into the ocean and I started casting, and lo and behold, I caught fish. The same thing with my first sea trout. No clue what I was doing, both up in Northeast and down in the Gulf Coast. Just walked out in the water and started casting, and I started catching fish. So is it the highest percentage game? No, but you aren't going to have any guarantees in fly fishing regardless of where you are or what you're doing. But we will talk in a future episode about some locations, techniques, and that incredibly vital topic of tides. All right, this week on Casting Across, 2 articles. The first one that came out was a fly fisher's pickerel apology, in which I talk about how I love pickerel. So if you never caught a pickerel, read this. If you hate pickerel, read this. It might change your mind. And then on Wednesday, I released an article called Vests in Deep Water. It's a story about my first fly fishing vest and how it came with me on a harrowing adventure of sunken canoes and melted shoes. Today's recommendation is for Bill Dance's YouTube channel, and not just Bill Dance's YouTube channel, but the playlist called Bloopers, Goof Ups, and Funny Moments. Hopefully I'm preaching to the choir, but if you haven't seen the blooper reels of Bill Dance fishing, you are really missing out. And if you haven't seen Bill Dance fishing, you're really missing out. I almost feel like not qualifying this anymore and just saying, go to Bill Dance Fishing on YouTube. If you just Google Bill Dance, you'll get it. Google. If you search Bill Dance on YouTube, you get it. But his name of his channel is Bill Dance Fishing, one word. Then go to his playlists and go to Goof Ups and bloopers, and prepare to just have some good, clean fun at poor Bill's expense. But enjoy. You're welcome. Thank you for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast in iTunes. Then head over to castingacross.com where you'll find more info on this podcast and 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.